Welcome to Issues and Answers with your host, Diane Kinderwater. Issues and Answers is presented as a public service to inform, educate, and better the lives of New Mexicans. And now, Issues and Answers with your host, Diane Kinderwater.
Welcome to the program. I'm Diane Kinderwater. Things can't get much worse than this. Can you imagine going to an air show with your children, with your neighbors, with your friends, with your family, and seeing two airplanes collide in midair? It happened. We've heard it in the news. It happened at a Dallas air show recently. I have on the program today Dr. Diehl. He wrote the book, Air Safety Investigations, Using Science to Save Lives, One Crash at a Time. He is an air safety investigator. Oftentimes when there are plane crashes throughout the world, local media, national media, contact Dr. Diehl about what could have happened. Now, he has been contacted already from local media, and he's here on KCHF TV to give us his insight of what could have happened at that air show. It was, again, mid-air collision of World War II planes. I think it was a B-17 and a bomber, a P-63. A flyer. We don't know what has happened, and we may not know for months or if even year what happened in this crash. But Dr. Diehl is with us to share his thoughts about that, about air shows in general. I know we certainly have them at Kirtland Air Force bases and our Air Force bases here in New Mexico, and other thoughts about air safety. So please stay with us as we talk to Dr. Diehl right after this. I have Dr. Diehl with us. He wrote the book Air Safety Investigation. Also, he wrote Armageddon's Angel, which is a Cuban Missile Crisis thriller. We were going to talk about another show with him as we talked about the 60th anniversary of the ending of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there were so many fascinating things we didn't get to touch upon that, but we might get to touch upon it in this book. It has something to do with aircrafts as well, as they tried to take over an airplane. The heroine, I guess, in the story tried to hijack. Of course, we don't talk about hijacking any longer. We'll talk to Dr. Diehl about what happened. Now that I'm thinking about it, what happened to hijacking? We don't have that anymore. But we're going to talk about that crisis that happened at the Dallas Air Show. Two planes collided in midair as families were there enjoying the show. And Dr. Diehl, you've been contacted by local media and national media already about this because you are an airplane investigator. You're not investigating this crash, but you have some thoughts about it.
Well, yeah, I worked as an air safety investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, later for the FAA, and ended up as a military air crash investigator out here at Kirtland, which the safety center is located right here in Albuquerque.
What safety center?
Yeah, the Air Force Safety Center is located at Kirtland Air Force Base, and that's where I worked, the last place I worked as an investigator. And of course, when these crashes, these dramatic events occur, my phone starts to ring, and it's either the Associated Press or CNN or somebody. And of course, we all want to know what happened immediately. And clearly, when they do these investigations, when the government does these investigations, it usually takes months and sometimes, a year or two, because they're very meticulous. Now, here's what I know about the Dallas mid-air collision.
And now, was that an air show recently? And I think at this point, 6 people so far, I'm not sure if the number has grown, 6 people died. And again, the horror, we saw it on the media, just people watching an air show. World War II, B-17 bomber and a P-63.
63 King Cobra.
Just crashed.
Yeah. From what we know, and again, this does not come from the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm a former NTSB. I'm not speaking as a current government investigator, but apparently, reportedly, The fighter planes, the faster fighter planes were on an inside loop turning to the left, okay, during the air show.
That's the 63.
The P-63, yeah. And the other fighters. There were a whole bunch of aircraft, both bombers and fighters. And the slower aircraft were supposedly to circle to the right. So you got faster airplanes circling to the left in a racetrack pattern. The bombers doing a flyby to the right. They're slower, of course. And somehow the two patterns intersected. We all saw the footage. And the P-63 hit the bigger B-17. It overtook the B-17 and literally cut it in half. It hit right behind the wing. We saw the tail come off the B-17, the fuselage, the back of the airplane, and it tumbled to the ground. The P-63 pilot and I guess there were 5 aboard the 17, all were killed. Now, tragic though that was, nobody on the ground was hurt. And of course, I'll tell you, the NTSB, when they investigate these accidents, they are particularly conscious of ground casualties because these people just came for an air show. The pilots understand there's some risk involved. And when I'm an aviation psychologist, when I would lecture Air Force pilots, I'd say, remember, when you're in combat or in an air show, don't let the testosterone and the adrenaline get away from you because you get excited and, but remember to use good judgment. Well, somehow we don't know exactly who, it could have been one or both of the aircraft got off course, apparently, out of their circuit, and they ran together, and we'll know probably months from now, years from now, what happened. Now, neither of these airplanes have flight data recorders. Maybe somebody had a voice recorder. There's a lot of video of this, but
because people from the air show were all videotaping the planes as for their enjoyment.
Another thing I'd mention, Diane, some of the wreckage actually ended up on a highway, which I'm sure the NTSB is going to now have to rethink about how do we keep these planes, if they do crash, away from causing any ground casualties. That's a big issue with the National Transportation Safety Board.
This P-63 was a fighter jet.
No, it was
not a jet, fighter.
A piston.
Plane.
They're both piston planes.
So they're off course, but it hit the B-17 bomber. Couldn't he see it? Couldn't he see it in front of him?
Well,
they're off course, but couldn't he not see it?
Fortunately, there was a lot of video, and what Al Diehl saw is that the B-17, my right hand, was basically flying straight and level. The P-63 came up much faster, and it was banked, even though it was drifting to the right towards the B-17, it was banked to the left. So this pilot, the B-17 could have been, probably was, I'm assuming, he obviously didn't intend to get that close to the 17. I think it was in his blind spot, and he literally T-boned, if you will, as we say in automobile crashes, this bigger, slower airplane.
How could it be in a blind? Where is the blind spot?
Well, because if
he hit him from behind, where's the blind spot?
The front of his airplane. Now, it turns out in the P-63, it's probably one of the few fighters where the engine's actually in the back, like a Volkswagen. But you can't see. There's a cowling, there's a propeller, and that blocks your forward and slightly downward. Remember, he's banking to his left, and the airplane's on his right. So the metal, not the plexiglass that you look out of, is on his right. So he can't. That's a blind spot, just like we have blind spots at our cars, and we tell you to move your head around when you come to.
What else would you like to share about this? We're going to talk about other air shows.
Oh, sure.
This Dallas air show catastrophe. What else can you share with us?
Yeah, the investigation continues, obviously, in Dallas. But we've had another tragedy in Reno, which is famous for air races, Reno, Nevada. And there was a collision there between 2 jets about 2-3 months ago, where the pilots were both killed tragically. And
what did you call it, a race?
Yeah, they actually have race, just like automobile races. They go around a circuit. They may have a dozen airplanes flying around what they call pylons to see who can finish the circuit quickest.
Where's the pylon? Where's the pylon?
Pylons are out in the middle of an airfield. These are maybe 50-foot high, almost like very high telephone poles. They're colored. so you can see them, and you don't, obviously you have to stay outside the pylon just like a race driver stays on the track. They have a fixed pattern. They're supposed to fly, but they're all jockeying for position. And you know, a few months ago, these were jets. These were actually Czechoslovakian, as I recall, made jet aircraft that are available. You can buy them for $50,000 here in the States. So these wealthy businessmen, I'm assuming, maybe they were, I don't know if they were in business, but they were racing and they ran together, and unfortunately they both died. Now, a few years ago, there was an even more tragic event.
Wait, before you go to a few years ago, this Reno, I'd never heard of it. I've heard of race car races, obviously, but not airplane races in Reno.
Yeah, Reno has the annual races every year. They have dozens of events. It's kind of like Indianapolis.
What?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's an annual event.
But I mean, how many planes are going around the same pylons and they're trying to jockey and go in between like the race cars do?
Exactly. And Diane, just so you understand, there's different categories. They race World War II type airplanes in one race, and then they race.
No, that's fine.
And
but how many would be in the race at a time?
Probably a dozen.
12.
Yeah, I'm guessing.
And they're trying. I've seen the race cars jockeying, and of course they say people are just waiting for the accidents.
Yeah.
I've heard that about race cars, right?
Oh, yeah.
They sit there for 10 hours watching these races and supposedly waiting for an accident. But I didn't know planes were doing that. Jockeying positions?
Absolutely.
Isn't that dangerous?
Oh, yeah. And that's why the big concern is the NTSB and the FAA know these pilots realize they're at risk. Now, they try to minimize the risk. They brief the pilots. There's people called air bosses that talk about, you know, what's supposed to happen if somebody has a mechanical emergency, how you're supposed to break out of the pattern and all that, just like they do in car races. But the NTSB is very much concerned about protecting the public watching the races. And a few years ago, there was a World War II P-51, another piston-powered fighter plane, heavily modified, and the tail, it's called a trim tab on the back of the tail, became loose. It was flying much faster than it had ever been designed to fly in wartime. This tail thing mechanism broke, and the plane ended up crashing, and the wreckage went into the crowd, killing several people that were mere spectators.
Yeah.
And trust me, the NTSB got very excited about that, and they probably, and I don't remember their exact recommendations, but they probably required more inspections on these aircraft, these World War II aircraft, and I would think they probably looked at moving the crowd even further back. The crowd likes to be close, just like in the car races, but especially in an aircraft situation, these planes can fly a long distance if they collide or if they have a mechanical problem.
Never thought of that. I've gone to see that my share of air shows. You want to get as close as possible, but maybe now I don't.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, my brother was an F-16 pilot and put on air shows for the Air Force, and he went through the policy. That's what I know about the air shows mainly, is he would tell me how they would brief him about how you have to stay, I think it was 1,500 feet away from what they called the crowd line. So if you're going to do your F-16 loops and stuff like that, you can't get closer than, at that time, 1,500 feet. Now, these are military air shows and military pilots. I'm not saying that's the rule at civilian air shows, but the government in particular wants to protect the public. They realize these pilots, you know, first of all, in the case of the military, they have ejection seats, but they are particularly keen on protecting civilian witnesses, if you will.
You know, it's interesting about these air shows. I think a lot of the military ones are to inspire the young people to perhaps join the military.
Absolutely, and to show the taxpayers where their money is going. These are dramatic events, but we want to all stay safe and protect the spectators.
But how, as a psychologist as well, how can you imagine anybody who is watching that show perhaps want to become a pilot at that point?
Well, it's funny. The people that want to become pilots are usually risk takers, and you know, one of the big things I had to do, and other people, the leadership. I was never in the leadership of the Air Force, but you have to talk to your pilots and make sure they balance risk, with benefit. And of course, in military operations, by definition, things are dangerous. So you've got to do some rational evaluation. Is it worth going into that valley to get that missile site, surface-to-air missile site, or should we try to do it with missiles standoff? Those are the kind of calculations you do in the military and also in the civilian world at air shows.
Yeah. What's interesting now, we're using a lot of computers to do all that risk-taking calculations now.
Oh,
in
yeah.
the military. Amazing. What do you know about that, Dr. Diehl?
Well, the Air Force and the other services do what they call risk management, and I was involved in coming up with some of the algorithms years ago for assessing this. But that's right. There's several things we want pilots and aircrew members to think about. One is their communications with each other. It's called crew resource management. And that's the overall training technique. And you teach pilots and other crew members to speak up. If you see the aircraft commander going on the wrong heading, don't assume that he knows where he's going. You, as an enlisted loadmaster or flight engineer, have the authority to say, Colonel, I think we're off course. I think that controller said 260, not 270 on the heading. And the colonel now is trained to say, thank you, Sergeant. You're absolutely right. I'll call the controller, and that way they didn't hit, they don't hit the mountain or bomb the wrong target. So we do that now systematically, and we assess risk systematically with computers.
Regarding air safety, anything else you'd like to share before we move on to your nonfiction novel that you wrote?
Well, I just simply say that particularly flying airliners is very safe. We still have these crashes at air shows. We unfortunately still have light aircraft, general aviation aircraft that crash, but people shouldn't worry about getting on an airliner. The old cliche about the most dangerous part of the trip is the drive to the airport is literally true.
Of course, during this holiday season, people will be heading to the airports, and they'll be traveling more than ever this holiday season. There is a concern, though, with overcrowded planes and fatigue of the pilots and all of these things that have been happening in recent years. There's a concern over that as well, though.
Well, in the back of that book, I identified 10 things, that's the back, in the rear. In the chapter, Appendix B, I talk about 10 things you can do. Things like, don't wear synthetic fibers. In case of a fire, that nylon will melt. Cotton and wool and leather won't. Don't wear high heels because they're hard to, you can puncture the slides. So there's
puncture the slides in case of an emergency.
A rare emergency.
Okay.
And don't take that extra drink because you want to be sober in case there is an emergency. So those are the kind of suggestions I made in Appendix B of Air Safety Investigators. These are things you can do, but the main thing you need to do is not worry about this because the airlines are so safe now. And how that came about is in large part due to the NTSB, FAA, and the equipment designers improving the product.
Moving on to that, regarding safety and your novel, we were discussing that 60 years ago, October was the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was in October 1962. There was another show we had with Dr. Alan Diehl regarding that. It's a thriller of a show. But moving on, we're going to move on to your book, The Cuban Missile Crisis Thriller. And there's a hijacking involved in this book that brings me to think, what happened to hijacking? Dr. Diehl, what happened to hijacking? Something that we don't even think about anymore, really. But we used to. Planes seem to be hijacked all the time.
Well,
Let's go back in history.
Okay, yeah. Back in the 80s, when I was very active in this, it was the Cuban refugees that were hijacking, and criminals were hijacking airplanes to go back to Cuba. But then we went through after
Wait, who were they?
They were mainly Cuban refugees that had come over on the, Castro emptied his jails and sent these criminals, in some cases, not all of them, I'm not saying all Cuban refugees are criminals, but the criminals, many cases, did things in this country, and to escape law enforcement, they would hijack an airliner. That was the big thing back in the 80s. One of the big things.
That was in the 80s that was happening. 70s, 80s, I don't.
Yeah, 80s primarily, late 70s, mid 80s. As a matter of fact, there was one right here in Albuquerque where these guys were not Cuban, but they had done some crime. The cops were about to catch them, and they hijacked an airplane, went back to Havana, not realizing that Castro usually sent those kind of people back to U.S. law enforcement.
Okay, we're talking about hijacking. Let's talk about that case in Albuquerque. That was when? If you're,
I just remember reading about it. I didn't work on it, but I do remember it did occur, and I think it was in the late 70s. And it seems to me they were robbers that were escaping from the police, and they got to the airport, had a gun, and took an airliner to Cuba.
They wanted to go to Cuba. They thought they'd have refuge at Cuba.
They hoped that Castro would give them asylum.
But the other exiles, or the people who were Cubans, wanted to go. They were criminals, wanted to go back to Cuba. They were hijacking planes all the time.
Yeah, they were.
It seemed.
Remember, most of the people that were released and came in the 80s to America from Cuba were just people escaping Castro. But a handful, remember, Castro opened up his jails and sent some really bad people. Not the majority, but there were a few rapists and robbers and murderers that were. And
they continued their crime sprees here. And then they wanted to go back.
They thought they could escape.
So how did hijacking end?
Well, it ended when the government finally stepped in, and we now have to go through all this security, and they actually do a lot of profiling, and they know pretty well, even before you board the aircraft, if you buy a ticket, I got to be kind of careful here. They look for people that buy tickets with cash at the last minute. Those people tend to be more at risk.
So prior to 9/11, 2001. The bombing of the
World Trade
Centers. Now that's when I recall a big
change.
Big change at the airports. But you were saying in the 80s to stop the hijacking. I don't remember going through.
They had some countermeasures in the 80s because of mainly people going back to Cuba.
Yeah, the hijacking.
But you're right. Things really got intense after 9/11. And in those cases, they were looking for Arab terrorists, Muslims.
But the 80s, there was more. I mean, were people allowed to take guns?
It was criminals. And, we also had the famous D.B. Cooper thing where he hijacked the airplane up in, I think it was Tacoma or Seattle for money. He got $250,000, jumped out. They never found him. They found a few of the $20 bills that, so they don't know if he was killed or what. But yeah, the hijacking has gone away. And in this book, now this is a novel, I've got to say. I don't want to ruin the book, but this school teacher falls in love with a Russian who's a missile officer. They had.
Now where, in what country was this?
This is Cuba.
Okay.
This is the missile crisis, and this is really
because Russia was putting missiles in Cuba that could reach our shores easily, our coast. Okay, so this is in Cuba. A Russian missile officer and a Cuban
school teacher.
Okay.
Now, the real backstory here, Diane, is that in addition to the strategic missiles that could reach America, Khrushchev put 96 battlefield or tactical nukes, and he gave the keys to majors and captains and lieutenants. And he told them, basically their orders were, if you see the Americans attacking, you are free. We're not going to be able to tell you to launch your missiles. The strategic missiles can only be launched with Khrushchev's authority. But the tactical missiles were, in fact, under the control of these junior officers. And we had 18,000 Marines on Guantanamo. What if one of these officers was a little unbalanced and wanted to attack Guantanamo? That's kind of the essence of this novel. And I don't know if there were unbalanced. No one ever fired a tactical nuke in Cuba, fortunately. And Khrushchev eventually, he was intending to leave them after he took the strategic missiles out. He was going to leave the tacticals there with Castro, and then he realized and Che Guevara was the other Cuban leader. They're crazy. I'm not going to leave those people hold tactical nukes, my tactical nukes.
How did you come up with this idea of this book?
Well, I found out how close we were to blowing up the world. In the other segment, we'll talk about how the plans for the invasion of Cuba were literally lost when an Air Force jet, this is not novel stuff, this actually happened. The baggage compartment door came open, the plans were lost. The military had to tell Kennedy, we're not ready to invade, and that gave him time to come up with the blockade. So
rethink an all-out bombing to have a blockade instead, because
instead a blockade.
The plans were lost. This is what you've learned. We talked about it in another show. The plans were lost.
But
you found that out. So how did you think about this type of book?
Well, I was a military officer, and I was briefed officially. That was an unofficial briefing about the lost plans.
But to come up with the story.
Well, I talked to people from Los Alamos. We'll talk about that. They came up with sensitive Geiger counters to inform Kennedy that they really did have nukes aboard those freighters. He didn't know that, but Los Alamos helped him determine that. Secondly, I talked to one of the individuals from the National Security Agency that was monitoring the Russian radio network that was controlling not just the strategic nukes, but especially the tactical nukes. And this individual told me that when they pulled out, this is nonfiction, he told me that when they pulled out the tactical nukes, the red phone rang, and the National Security Agency official, who had been also monitoring the network, had been asleep for an hour, so he handed the red phone to this guy who was an airman second class, and the airman said, it's John Kennedy on the phone, and he wants to talk to somebody that knows if the Russians are taking out the nukes. And he said, I told the president, I've learned some new Russian cuss words. These Russian troops are unhappy with Khrushchev. But anyway, so I talked to a lot of people that were really involved.
Is this a love story or a thriller, or how do you characterize this?
Both. The school teacher falls for this major, and they decide to prevent World War III.
They decide to prevent it.
Yeah.
But as we talked about in our other program, your bomb revelation was that the plans were lost.
Giving Kennedy time to think about things.
Could not use those plans to invade, to bomb out these missiles, so he had time to think about doing the blockade, quarantine, and we did avoid World War III.
And hopefully the same thing will happen in the Ukraine today.
Thank you. Dr. Ellen Diehl, thank you for bringing such fascinating things and your fiction, non-fiction books, your novel.
It's both.
Thanks for watching. I'm Diane Kinderwater. Make it a great week with your family. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Issues and Answers with your host Diane Kinderwater is presented as a public service to inform, educate, and better the lives of New Mexicans. To comment on today's program or to purchase a copy of any Issues and Answers program, visit sunbroadcasting.org or call us at 505-345-1991.